Nothing collapsed. Nothing broke apart. And yet, something no longer fits the way it used to. Your life may look almost the same from the outside. You still move through your responsibilities. You still answer when needed. You still know how to carry yourself through the day. But inwardly, the arrangement has changed. There are moments now when the old reflex doesn't arrive. A tension appears, and you don't immediately assume it began with you. Someone grows distant, and your mind doesn't rush as quickly to self-correction. A misunderstanding takes shape, and for the first time, something in you stays still long enough to ask a different question. What if I was never the problem? Not in the dramatic sense. Not as a slogan. Not as a way of making others wrong. Something quieter than that. A realization so subtle it almost feels incomplete. Because for a long time, your mind may have been organized around a hidden assumption. If something felt strained, unclear, disappointed, or off, it must somehow lead back to you. Not always consciously. Not in words, but in posture, in interpretation, in the almost automatic movement towards self-adjustment. You reviewed your tone. You reconsidered your motives. You replayed moments in private, searching for the place where you had made things difficult, too heavy, too complicated, too much. And after enough years of doing that, self-blame stops feeling like a reaction. It starts to feel like intelligence. It starts to feel responsible, mature, necessary, until one day, it doesn't. Not because you become defensive, not because you stop reflecting, but because something in you begins to notice how often your inner world has been taking responsibility for tensions it did not create. And that realization does not bring immediate relief. It brings silence, because once that question appears, what if I was never the problem? Other questions begin to follow. What exactly was I carrying all this time? What belonged to me, and what never did? And why did it take so long to see the difference? This is one of the quiet turning points of the Sophia stage. Not the moment you become certain, the moment you stop assuming guilt by default. And once that shift begins, the whole structure of your inner life starts to rearrange itself. Once that question appears, something subtle begins to change inside you. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small moments where tension used to trigger an immediate correction. For a long time, your inner system may have worked like this. Something feels wrong. Someone reacts unexpectedly. A conversation turns slightly uncomfortable. And almost instantly, your attention moves inward. What did I do wrong? Did I say something the wrong way? Was I too intense? Too distant? Too much? The process happens so quickly it barely feels like a choice. It feels like awareness, like emotional intelligence, like responsibility. But over time, that reflex begins to shape how you see yourself in almost every situation. You stop seeing tension as something shared between people. You begin seeing it as something you need to correct. If someone withdraws, you review the last thing you said. If a moment becomes awkward, you search for the adjustment that might smooth it out. And because this pattern develops slowly, it often goes unnoticed for years. You simply become someone who reflects deeply, someone who reviews their words carefully, someone who takes responsibility seriously, all of which are valuable qualities. But when reflection quietly turns into automatic self-blame, something important disappears from view. The larger dynamic. Not every misunderstanding begins with you. Not every tension in a room was created by something you did. And not every emotional reaction belongs to the person who notices it first. Yet when the mind is used to moving inward whenever discomfort appears, the world slowly begins to organize itself around a single assumption. If something feels wrong, it must somehow lead back to me. That assumption can feel almost ethical. It can even feel mature. But it carries a hidden cost. Because when your attention is always directed toward correcting yourself, You rarely pause long enough to observe what else might be happening in the moment. You adjust before you fully see. You apologize before you fully understand. And over time, that pattern begins to feel like identity. You become the one who explains, the one who smooths tension, the one who quietly absorbs the weight of a moment so things can return to balance. Until something interrupts the pattern. A moment where the usual correction simply doesn't arrive. A conversation becomes tense, and instead of immediately reviewing yourself, you notice the space around the moment. Someone reacts strongly, and for the first time your mind does not rush to absorb the impact. You observe, not defensively, not indifferently, just long enough to notice something new. That the situation has more than one center. That the emotional weight in the room may not belong entirely to you. And once that possibility enters awareness, a quiet shift begins. You still reflect on your actions. You still care about the effect you have on others. But the mind no longer rushes to assume that every tension must be your fault. Self-awareness remains. What begins to fade is the automatic movement towards self-blame. And when that sequence dissolves, perception starts to widen. You begin to see interactions instead of only your own reactions. You begin to notice patterns that once passed unnoticed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the question that appeared earlier begins to deepen. If I was not always the problem, then what exactly was happening in all those moments? And this is where a different kind of understanding begins to emerge. Not about blame, about perception. Once perception widens, something else becomes visible. For the first time, you begin to notice that situations rarely have a single center. Two people can live through the same moment and walk away with completely different interpretations. The words were the same. The tone was the same. The circumstances were the same. And yet the meaning becomes something entirely different in each mind. Carl Jung pointed to this when he spoke about what he called the personal equation. The idea is simple, but its implications are profound. Every person perceives reality through a psychological lens shaped by their own history, fears, expectations, and unconscious patterns. We don't encounter events as neutral observers. We interpret them. Two people may hear the same sentence. One experiences criticism. Another hears honesty. Two people may encounter the same silence. One feels rejected. Another simply notices space. The moment itself did not change. What changed was the psychological equation through which it was interpreted. And once you begin to see this, something important shifts. For years, you may have assumed that the emotional tone of a situation reflected something about you. If someone became distant, you searched for the mistake you must have made. If tension appeared in a conversation, you looked for the place where your words had gone wrong. But what Jung suggested is something many people overlook. Every reaction carries the imprint of the person experiencing it. Sometimes what looks like a judgment about you is actually an expression of someone else's internal landscape. Their expectations, their insecurities, their unresolved conflicts. This does not mean you are never responsible for what happens in your relationships. It simply means that responsibility is rarely located in only one place. Interactions are systems, two inner worlds meeting. And when those worlds interpret reality through different psychological equations, misunderstandings can appear even when no harm was intended. For someone used to assuming the role of self-correction, this realization can be unsettling, because it reveals something that was difficult to see before. Many moments you carried as personal failure may have been far more complex than they appeared at the time. Not because you were blameless, but because you were never the only variable in the equation. And once this becomes visible, the mind begins to revisit the past differently. Not to rewrite it, but to understand it with a wider lens. You remember conversations where you tried repeatedly to clarify yourself. Moments where you apologized without fully knowing why. Situations where the tension in the room seemed to settle on you, even though the origins of that tension were never entirely clear. At the time, it felt responsible to absorb that weight. Now something inside you pauses long enough to ask a different question. Was I actually seeing the whole picture back then? Or was I interpreting every moment through a psychological equation that quietly assumed I must be the source of the problem? And when that question appears, another layer of understanding begins to form. Because sometimes the issue was not only how others perceived you, sometimes it was also how you perceived yourself. And that pattern has its own psychological gravity. But the equation did not exist only in the minds of other people. It also existed in the way you interpreted yourself. Because while others were seeing the world through their own psychological lens, you may have been looking at every situation through another quiet filter. The assumption that if something felt wrong, the cause must somehow lead back to you. Carl Jung described a pattern that often supports this tendency. He called it the inferiority complex. Not in the casual sense people use today, simply meaning low self-esteem. What Jung observed was more subtle. In some personalities, the mind develops a quiet tendency to assume deficiency before examining the full situation. When something goes wrong, the conclusion appears almost instantly. I must have done something wrong. Not because evidence clearly points there, but because the psyche has learned to organize itself around that possibility. This pattern often begins early. A child learns to read emotional signals carefully. Tension in a room, disappointment in a voice, a change in someone's expression. And over time, the safest response becomes adjustment. You become attentive. You become thoughtful. You become someone who reflects deeply on your own behavior. Again, none of this is inherently unhealthy. In many ways, it creates empathy. It creates awareness. But if this orientation becomes too strong, something else happens. Your mind begins to interpret complex situations through a single lens. If tension appears, you look inward first. If someone reacts strongly, you review your words. If a relationship becomes unstable, you search for the flaw in yourself that might explain it. And because you are thoughtful, you almost always find something. Something you could have said differently. Something you might have expressed more clearly. Something you wish you had handled with more care. So the pattern reinforces itself. Every situation becomes further evidence that self-correction was the right instinct. Until eventually, the possibility that you might not be the central cause rarely enters the analysis at all. But the moment we described earlier begins to interrupt that gravity. A moment when the automatic movement toward self-blame slows down. Not because you stop reflecting, but because something in your awareness becomes wider. You begin to see that people carry their own emotional histories into every interaction. Their fears, their expectations, their unresolved frustrations. Sometimes what you experienced as criticism was actually someone else's projection. Sometimes what felt like rejection had more to do with their own inner conflict than with anything you did. And slowly, the mind begins to release something it has been carrying for a long time. The assumption that every difficult moment must be traced back to you. And when that assumption begins to loosen, something else slowly begins to change. Not only inside you, around you. Because for a long time, the way you moved through relationships may have been shaped by that quiet gravity of self-correction. When tension appeared, you softened it. When misunderstandings surfaced, you explained. When emotional distance appeared, you tried to restore balance. Not out of weakness, out of care, out of awareness, out of the sincere desire to keep things clear between people. But when the automatic reflex of self-blame begins to dissolve, something else changes along with it. You stop rushing to repair every emotional shift in the room. You still listen. You still care. But you begin to notice when attention does not actually belong to you. And for the first time, you allow that tension to remain where it originated. This is often where the outside world begins to react, because many relational patterns stabilize themselves through repetition. One person reacts. Another person absorbs. One person projects frustration. Another person tries to smooth it. One person withdraws. Another person moves closer to repair the distance. Over time, these roles become invisible agreements between people. No one speaks about them, but everyone begins to expect them. So when your role changes, even slightly, the entire dynamic shifts. A moment appears where someone reacts sharply, and instead of immediately explaining yourself, you simply pause. You listen. You remain present. But you do not rush to take responsibility for the entire emotional atmosphere. And this pause can feel unfamiliar to the other person, because for a long time, your self-correction may have helped restore equilibrium in the relationship. Without that reflex, the moment behaves differently. Sometimes the tension simply fades on its own. Sometimes it reveals something that was always there beneath the surface. And sometimes people react to the change. They may say you seem different, more distant, less engaged, harder to read. But often what they are actually noticing is something simpler. You are no longer automatically absorbing the emotional weight of the interaction. And when that weight remains where it originated, the dynamic becomes clearer. Some relationships adjust naturally. They become more balanced. Conversations become more direct. The emotional responsibility in the interaction becomes shared. But in other cases, something else becomes visible. The relationship may have depended more on your self-adjustment than you realized. Your explanations, your patience, your willingness to carry tension quietly so that harmony could return. When that role changes, the structure of the relationship becomes easier to see. Not because anyone is suddenly wrong, but because the balance of responsibility is no longer hidden. This realization can be uncomfortable, because for a long time, self-correction felt like care. Now you begin to understand something more precise. Care does not require self-erasure. Understanding others does not require assuming every problem belongs to you. And once that becomes clear, something subtle begins to stabilize inside you. You still value connection. You still want clarity between people. But you are no longer willing to distort your own perception just to restore emotional balance in a moment. You allow the interaction to reveal itself. And in doing so, you begin to see relationships with a new kind of accuracy. Not through guilt, not through defense, but through observation. And that observation brings with it an emotion many people do not expect. Not relief, something closer to grief. And that observation often brings an emotion people do not expect. Not relief, something quieter than that. Grief. Because when your perception widens, you begin to see your past from a different angle. You remember moments where you worked hard to explain yourself. Conversations where you tried to clarify your intentions again and again. Situations where you took responsibility simply because someone had to stabilize the moment. At the time, it felt reasonable. It felt mature. It felt like the right thing to do. But now, with a wider lens, something becomes visible that was difficult to see before. How much effort went into correcting a problem that may not have been entirely yours to solve. This realization does not erase the sincerity behind what you did. You were trying to create understanding. You were trying to maintain connection. You were trying to keep relationships from dissolving into confusion. None of that was wasted. But the mind still pauses when it begins to see how often that effort moved in only one direction. How many conversations were spent explaining yourself. How many moments were spent trying to restore balance after something had already shifted. And for some people, this recognition arrives with a quiet question. Why did it take me so long to see this? But the answer is rarely simple. Because the patterns we are describing were not created by weakness. They were created by sensitivity, by awareness, by the ability to read emotional signals that others might overlook. Those qualities are not mistakes. They are part of what allowed you to understand people deeply. What changes now is not your capacity to understand others. What changes is the assumption that understanding requires you to carry everything that happens between you. And once that assumption dissolves, something inside you begins to settle. You still care. You still listen. You still reflect on your role when something truly belongs to you. But you no longer absorb every emotional shift in the environment as if it were your responsibility to resolve. That change can feel unfamiliar at first, because the mind was used to constant correction, constant adjustment, constant vigilance. Without that movement, the inner world becomes quieter. And quietness can feel strange when you have spent years trying to stabilize every situation around you. But slowly, the nervous system begins to understand something new. The stability of a relationship does not depend on one person carrying the entire emotional weight. Clarity does not require endless explanation, and connection does not require you to disappear inside other people's reactions. What begins to emerge instead is something much more balanced. Responsibility where responsibility belongs. Understanding where understanding is possible. And space where space is necessary. And in that space, a different form of inner stability begins to appear. Not the stability that comes from controlling every dynamic, but the stability that comes from no longer needing to. When this realization settles, it doesn't arrive like a victory. There is no dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. Most of the time, it appears quietly, in the way you stop replaying certain conversations, in the way your mind no longer rushes to correct itself after every small tension, in the way you begin to observe situations before absorbing them. Nothing about this change makes you indifferent. You still care about the people around you. You still value understanding. You still take responsibility when something truly belongs to you. But the center of gravity inside you has shifted. You are no longer organizing your entire perception around the possibility that you must be the problem. And when that shift happens, something unexpected begins to emerge. Space. Space to see people more clearly. Space to recognize dynamics that were once invisible. Space to understand that relationships are not sustained by one person quietly carrying the emotional weight of every interaction. This is one of the quiet turning points of the Sophia stage. Not because it makes life easier, but because it makes perception clearer. You begin to recognize what truly belongs to you and what never did. And that recognition changes the way you move through the world. Not louder, not more defensive, simply more grounded. But for many people, this realization is only one part of a deeper transformation. Because once you stop assuming that you are the problem, something else often begins to happen. Something inside you begins to loosen. Old roles start to fade. Old explanations stop feeling necessary. And at some point, you may notice a strange feeling that is difficult to describe. Not loss, not relief, just the quiet sense that something inside you has come to an end. And when that happens, the experience can feel even more confusing than the realization we described today. Because when something inside you truly ends, the way you see yourself and the world begins to change in ways you may not expect. And that is exactly what we explore in the next video. If you've begun to feel that quiet shift inside you, the next video may help you understand why.